right here. It's still early in the free viewing period, so please send people the link. Let them register and watch this information for free also. Each one of these, the phrase sharing is caring, bonuses that we have to go with it. Let's start episode 2. When it comes to vaccine safety and efficacy, environmental issues, and other such things, when it comes to defending the downtrodden or the underdog, Robert F Kennedy Jr. is an icon in this arena. He unabashedly has been speaking out and speaking the truth in ways like no one else. And his passion and his leadership as well, he had information, understanding that we need. Let's start maybe the big picture view of this whole COVID scenario over the past year or two. What have you been seeing from your point of view?
I think that the thing that surprises most people about this is that the response to the COVID pandemic has not really been a medical response. It's been more of a militarized and a monetized response. It's been about not providing early treatment to people, making a concerted effort to identify repurposed drugs to keep people from going into the hospital. But instead, it's about waiting for them to go to the hospital, and at that point, for many of them, it's too late, and keeping people on lockdown, all these draconian mandates for which there is really no scientific support, or very, very meager scientific support. Lockdowns, masking, social distancing, and they're all just as likely to cause more harms than good. And then, wait under house arrest for these miraculous vaccines that are going to arrive. And basically using all of these, this propaganda and censorship and the forced lockdowns, the cratering, the obliteration of the economy, the demolition of our middle class, the deconstruction of our Constitution, and inducing in the public this kind of, Stockholm syndrome, where people are terrified and where they become grateful to their captors, and they have the understanding that the only path to safety is complete obedience to their captors. And it's really done, I think, a lot of damage to democracy. It's the Constitution and to Western democracies globally.
I never kind of considered the Stockholm Syndrome aspect of this, but as you say, it makes a lot of sense, right? Because it is obedience, to being a captive and hoping that they'll come save the day, which is psychologically, especially on a social, psychological level, something I've never seen before in my lifetime. Do you have any reference point for this from your experience?
I don't. I think we've seen these kind of things in totalitarian regimes where people, for example, it's always dangerous to make comparisons to what happened, to the imposition of fascism before World War II. But a lot of the techniques and a lot of the sort of human reaction, the belief by populations who were oppressed populations like Jews and Gypsies and others, that if they just did what they were told, that things would be okay. Yeah. And there really wasn't an effort to resist on a large scale, at least at the beginning. I think we've seen that, and what I've spent a lot of time, because my family had long involvement with the CIA, really a 60-year fist fight with the CIA. And I've written about that extensively, including a whole book about it called American Values. And I researched it, and I read the CIA manuals, even the ones that are almost impossible to get your hands on now. And the CIA for 30 years was developing techniques for destroying indigenous societies and then imposing centralized control. And there were techniques that they used. They developed mind control techniques and population control techniques, and they talk about how you go in and you destroy local economies, you shatter and atomize traditional relationships and institutions, family relationships with your church, and that you sow chaos. And that so that people and you use propaganda and censorship to impose fear and to stop people from talking to each other and confuse the truth all the time. And then when there's total chaos, you bring in kind of a centralized control. And I think we've seen a lot of those techniques at work here. And if you one of the things that I learned when I was writing my book is a lot of people have heard of Event 201, which is this event that people can go view on the internet that occurred in October of 2019. So the best information now is that the virus was circulating in Wuhan by mid-September, around September 12th. The hospital parking lots were full. There was lots of chatter. There were people who were at the Wuhan lab, workers who had been sent to the hospital with COVID-like symptoms. So a month after that, you have Bill Gates and the former deputy director of the CIA, Avril Haines, who is now the head of national security under the Biden administration, and other people who were from social media networks, from the health agencies, from the media, very, very powerful people who come together at the Pierre Hotel in New York City, and they simulate a coronavirus pandemic, and specifically a coronavirus that has escaped from a laboratory-generated one. This is in October, when nobody knows that this is already happening. And the curious thing, for anybody who reads, and anybody can go on the internet and look at this, is they weren't talking about, they were talking about how do we respond to a pandemic, but there was no medical response. People weren't asking, how do you get vitamin D to people? How do you get zinc to people? How do you make sure that people get exercise, that have the right diets, that protect their immune systems? How do you quarantine the sick? And then let the healthy continue to go to work? How do you protect constitutional rights in a pandemic? None of that was drilled. Right. It was all about how do you impose censorship? How do you impose totalitarian controls? How do you impose mass vaccination on an unwilling population? And this is a strange thing, because there's never a time in human history when during the heat of a pandemic you've had people refuse an efficacious medicine. If there's an efficacious medicine, people are running for it. So why are they thinking in advance that people are going to resist this, vaccination? And yet that's what they drill. How do you make people do it? How do you make black people do it? And they say this they say, African Americans are likely to resist this. There's other demographics who are likely to resist. The thing they're drilling is not how do you reduce deaths and injuries and hospitalizations during a pandemic, but how do you use a pandemic as a pretext for obliterating democracy, for a coup d'etat against the American Constitution. And to impose, they talk about censorship. In fact, they spend a lot of time saying, how do we censor it? When people start saying that the microbe is laboratory generated, that the coronavirus is laboratory generated, they spend a whole section of the 4 sessions talking about how do you control people and force them to stop talking about that this pathogen is laboratory generated. So during the course of my book, people are really shocked when they see this. It was so prescient. It was, these people are like Nostradamus. Everything they predicted came true. And they talk about mRNA vaccines and how quickly they're going to put them out, everything. When I was researching the book, I discovered that this was not a lone incident. They had been doing this same drill for 20 years. And I found transcripts of at least 18 of them. And they were all written by people from the CIA, whose names I know and record, and including James Woolsey, who's a former director of the CIA, Robert Cadleck, Tara O'Toole, people who are deeply involved with the agency and who were deeply involved in imposing the biosecurity agenda after the anthrax attacks in 2001, when biosecurity became the spear tip of U.S. foreign policy. And in each of these simulations involved hundreds of thousands of people. They were top secret. Almost all of them included somebody who was very, very famous, like Senator Sam Nunn, UN Ambassador Madeleine Albright, Senator Frank Church, various congressmen, and those important figures would come in and give the imprimatur of legitimacy to what they were drilling. But many of them involved tens of thousands of frontline workers of hospital systems all over our country, of police and firefighters, of all of the law enforcement agencies, the FBI, the CIA, the Department of Homeland Security, and many, many others. They were simultaneously doing this in Canada and Europe and all over the country, all over the world. And so one of the first ones was called Operation Lockstep. Well, people have been, I think one of the baffling things about this whole pandemic to a lot of people has been everybody's kind of uneasy with this imposition of authoritarian controls that has occurred. But people keep wondering, how do they all do it at once? How do they know what to do? And they did it at the same time in France and Germany and Canada and Mexico and all over the world. Well, it turns out they've been drilling it for 20 years. And each one of these drills, which the intelligence agencies, not only from the United States, but from Great Britain and other nations are involved in, and each one of them is like a training exercise to teach people to override their most sacred values, which are constitutional rights, freedom of speech, freedom of property rights, and and privacy, and all of these rights that just get overwhelmed and thrown out. And people, a lot of people are uneasy with this. Say, how do they all know to do this at once? Why was this kind of lockstep reaction? How do you did it? But if you look at these simulations, it's very clear that they had all of the key players. And by the way, if you look at the people who took part in those simulations, including Event 201, 4 months later, the people who were running Event 201 were running the agencies. They stepped into place, like Avril Haines, the CIA, the former deputy director who played a key role in it, became Biden's director of national security in charge of the COVID response. And all the other people, or most of the other people who were involved, all got official positions where they were directing the pandemic response. But what had happened is they all got by participating in these tabletop drills, these war games, year after year after year, essentially were giving their sign off to this, this project to get rid of the Constitution and get rid of democracy. And they were saying, yeah, that's what you do. They were being told again and again, that's what you do when there's a pandemic. You get rid of democracy. You get rid of constitutional rights. You get rid of all of the things that basically define our country. And the key people were all signing off on it by participating again and again without knowing it. They were essentially signing off on this project. And if you look at, the CIA for many, many years was developing all of these techniques for manipulating individual people, but also manipulating populations. And they had, during, MK Ultra era from the 60s, the 50s, the 60s, and the early 70s up until it was all exposed in 75 by the Church Committee, they were developing means of how do you control people, how do you control populations. And one of the things, so they were doing experiments at 150 universities around the North America and Canada, the United States, all the way down to Guatemala. And they were experimenting on what they called expendable populations, people from institutions for intellectual disabilities, people from prisons, military people whose absence wouldn't be noticed. And they were using psychoactive drugs like LSD, they were using isolation, they were using physical torture, including waterboarding, but they were also using very, very sophisticated psychological warfare techniques, and particularly isolation and sensory deprivation, which they again and again say, if you want to really control a population, you isolate people, and it is more effective than any kind of torture. And then they had one of the experiments that the CIA appears to have been deeply involved in. It was called the Milgram experiment that took place in the 60s at Yale. And there was a young sociologist called Stanley Milgram, Dr. Stanley Milgram, and he recruited people from every walk of life, students, professors, construction workers, blacks, whites, every kind of American. And they would put the recruits in a room, and they would sit them at a table where there was a dial. They would dial, and they were told that when they twisted that dial, it would electrocute somebody in the next room, who they couldn't see, but who they were told was tied to a chair. And that person was actually an actor. And when they turned up the electricity, that person in the next room would scream, he would beg, he would cry, and they could hear the cries and shouts. And they would try to stop. They had a doctor in a white lab coat who was telling them, now turn it up higher, now turn it up higher. 67%, anybody can go out and look this up on Wikipedia. 67% of the people who took part in that experiment turned it up to 450 volts, which it was marked on the dial potentially lethal. A lot of them, none of them wanted to do it. They were all asking for permission to quit. And some of them were crying. And yet when the doctor in the white lab coat ordered them to do it, that order, that demand from an authority figure, overwhelmed their conscience, their most fundamental value, and they did something that they knew was wrong. And what Milgram concluded is that a voice of authority, particularly a doctor, can overwhelm human conscience in 67% of people and can get people to do things that they know is wrong. So, in many ways, you look at what's happening, and it looks like we're all engaged in a giant Milgram experiment, where Tony Fauci is the doctor in the lab coat, and he's telling us, you need to get rid of the Constitution. You need to censor speech. You need to get rid of the First Amendment. You need, the other part of the First Amendment, of course, is religious freedom, and you need to shut every church in the country for a year without any due process, without any hearing. And meanwhile, and simultaneously keep the liquor stores open as essential businesses. Well, there's nothing about liquor stores in the Constitution, but there's a lot about churches. And we got rid of property rights, closed every business in this country with no due process, no just compensation, 1 million businesses for a year. We got rid of jury trials. They wrote a law that says if this is the Seventh Amendment, that no American should be denied the right to a trial by their peers in any matter exceeding $25 in value. So that's the whole constitutional provision. And yet they said, you don't get a jury trial. You don't get any trial at all if somebody involved in a countermeasure injures you. No matter how negligent that company is, no matter how dishonest, no matter how reckless, no matter how grievous your injury, no matter how toxic the ingredients of that product, you cannot sue them. So they've gotten rid of that amendment. They've gotten rid of the prohibitions against unwarranted searches and seizures. Our privacy rights now, you have to tell whether you got the vaccine or